There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. In late 2001, as the United States entered Afghanistan for what became a 20-year occupation, another critical event passed by largely unnoticed. At a conference in Doha, the World Trade Organization voted to accept China as a full member. The absorption of 1.3 billion people into the world's largest economic organization placed Beijing at the center of international commerce. From that moment onwards, global trade shifted in favor of China. Steadily, it became the leading trading partner in Asia, Africa, Europe, and South America. Chinese manufacturing turned the country into the world's factory. But to get to this point, China had to go through a painful process of economic experimentation. So, how did it do it? How did China evolve from an impoverished agrarian society into the industrial power we know today? I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's video is sponsored by Ground News. Now you may have noticed that the media landscape is deeply split. Algorithms push polarizing content to generate clicks. As a result, people are unknowingly stuck in their respective information bubbles. Ground News helps you escape that cycle of confirmation bias. I like how it empowers the user with tools to compare different sources that are covering the same story. The bias distribution bar is useful, and I appreciate that the app doesn't tap into your browsing history. But my favorite component is the blind spot feature. It shows you the stories you might be missing or content that is underreported. If you're the kind of person who likes seeing all sides of an issue, then Ground News is for you. Visit ground.news/Caspian to download the free app. The first 50 people to download the app and use the code Caspian will get 1 month of premium access. China's rapid ascent is not an anomaly, but rather a return to historical normality. As late as 1800, the Qing Empire accounted for almost 1/3 of the global GDP. Domestically, China possessed a market economy as sophisticated as those in Europe. Silk, textiles, and ceramics were exported in massive quantities to Europe, resulting in an uneven trade surplus. However, China's enormous population could only carry it so far. As the Industrial Revolution took hold in the West, the generated surplus wealth allowed the European empires to accelerate their colonial pursuits. For China, it was a disaster. Beginning with the Opium War of 1839, the state was put on the back foot by a series of foreign incursions. First, British steamships forced Chinese ports to open up to the opium trade. Then, the Russians annexed a portion of Manchuria, while by 1895, Japan had captured both the Liaodong Peninsula and Taiwan. All this while a series of violent rebellions and civil wars risked tearing the nation apart. The leadership in Beijing knew that industrialization was crucial to survival, but without strong central governance, the state was too large and self-sufficient to change its outdated ways. The Qing dynasty's modernization programs turned to failure. Even the nationalist government, which had replaced imperial rule, proved to be incapable. Instead, the instability continued until Japanese forces were expelled from the mainland in 1945, with the Nationalist Party following suit 4 years later. Now, in the hands of a communist government, China was finally in a place where it could pass nationwide reforms. However, mistrust of the outside world shaped China's political apparatus. Led by Mao Zedong, the Beijing government believed that only a highly centralized state with total control over the population could muster the resources to close the industrial gap with its foreign rivals. Communism, with its emphasis on state control, seemed a perfect fit for China. Initially, there was some success. Industrial output was raised, particularly in steel, coal, and petrochemical production. But while heavy industry was booming, agricultural production was lagging. In the context of a post-war baby boom and the urbanization of the workforce, a poorly performing agricultural sector put tremendous strain on China's food security. Something had to be done. So Mao placed farmlands in the hands of agrarian communes, which were assigned grain quotas. By doing so, it was believed that agricultural output would increase just as industrial output had done previously. Moreover, Mao broke up the countryside into self-contained regional units with the aim to make China's provinces expendable to the operations of the state. It sounds strange when you think of it now, but at the time, China had witnessed almost 2 centuries of constant conflict. Mao, being a military man, designed an economic policy centered around military conflict. Not surprisingly, the plan was a total failure. By 1959, economic mismanagement, over-reporting of grain production, and a lack of incentives for individual farmers snowballed into the worst famine in human history. Up to 50 million people lost their lives, a number that is difficult to fathom. Far from modernizing China, Mao's reckless policymaking had squandered the country's potential. Meanwhile, in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, large manufacturing industries were developing throughout the 1960s and 1970s. What was it that China did so wrong and its neighbors so right? The answer has everything to do with the mindset. As early as mid-19th century, Japan, having observed the fate of China at the hands of foreign powers, adopted a Western style to economics, science, and politics. This allowed the nation to build up its military capacity, and within a few decades, it had climbed to great power status. Resource poor by itself, Japan fueled its imperial expansion by acquiring colonies in both Korea and Taiwan. Though the peoples of these territories were brutally repressed, resource extraction required Tokyo to invest extensively in the public works of its colonies, including roads, railways, and ports. By the time the Allies defeated Japan in 1945, all 3 countries had developed a pre-industrial base with export infrastructures. The East Asian playbook laid the groundwork for their success. In the post-war years, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan further developed their assets, and though each state had its own quirks, they generally followed a 3-step pattern. The first was land reform. By breaking up larger estates into small holdings, the East Asian states crushed the lobbying power of large agricultural businesses. This fostered market competition, which in turn drove up food production. The increased efficiency of the agricultural system also triggered a mass migration of peasants to the cities in search of employment. Urbanization was taking hold across the periphery. The second step was to gear the economy towards export-oriented manufacturing. By using their new urban workforce and existing export infrastructure, the East Asian states came to dominate global manufacturing, particularly in consumer electronics. And by focusing on exports, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan could generate the foreign exchange needed to accelerate the process of technology transfers. Thirdly, each state adopted restrictive financial policies to direct capital to the areas favored by its development strategy. Low interest rates funneled cash flows back into state investments in infrastructure and corporate investment in industry, while capital controls prevented wealthy individuals from moving their money offshore. At the same time, an undervalued exchange rate made East Asian exports even more competitive. Naturally, these policies were met with opposition from Western businesses. The fact that Asian companies had open access to the American market while American companies were shut out of Asia rubbed many business owners the wrong way, as did the high amount of intellectual property theft following from west to east. America at the time was okay with this trade-off because it needed strong, capable allies in Asia to counter communist influence. This then explains why Washington departed from its free trade principles and allowed its allies to run mercantilist economies. The success of the East Asian states troubled Beijing in terms of power projection. So when Mao passed away in 1976, his successor, Deng Xiaoping, went into a different direction. He overhauled the economic system and applied the three-step roadmap used by Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. China's secret weapon was its massive size, both territorial and demographic. Each province was the size of entire nations, which meant that Deng could run economic experiments locally before rolling things out at a national level. For example, in Anhui, the agricultural communes were broken into smaller plots, allowing rural smallholders to keep surplus grain. The incentive created a surge in food production. Between 1978 and 1984, agricultural production rose by 1/3, and average farm incomes more than doubled. Moreover, increased security over land ownership encouraged farmers to invest in capital goods like tractors and other types of machinery. As farming was mechanized, agricultural output and local manufacturing increased steadily. In the major cities, manufacturing processes were altered to suit China's natural advantages. Unlike Mao, who had prioritized heavy industry, Deng recognized that China's strength lay in its massive workforce. So it made sense to use that labor force and reschedule the focus on heavy industries down the line. Consequently, Deng prioritized producing light industrial goods for exports, such as clothing, cosmetics, and toys. Made in China became a brand on its own. Meanwhile, new factories were set up, which encouraged urbanization. China's urban population grew from 190 million in 1980 to 300 million a decade later. Over time, as Beijing accumulated wealth, certain constraints on private businesses were loosened, which drove some state-owned enterprises to become more competitive. From the late 1970s onwards, China progressively became the world's factory. China's biggest test, however, was its access to technology. Though Washington permitted Tokyo, South Korea, and Taiwan to run mercantilist economies unconditionally, China had to offer American businesses something in return. Beijing came up with a tempting concept. It permitted export-oriented companies to set up factories in special economic zones along the coast, and then upgraded the regional export infrastructure with ports, roads, and railways. It was this combination of first world infrastructure and third world labor costs that Western companies found irresistible. Consequently, foreign direct investment increased from zero in 1979 to 40 billion in 1997, peaking at 290 billion in 2013. Being the world's factory came with all sorts of perks. With the amount of foreign exchange flowing into the country, Beijing could either buy the technological capital it needed or steal it, since the Western businesses operated on Chinese soil. Either way, by closing the technological gap, China's size and natural advantages came to dominate global trade. For outsiders, China's trial and error approach and its ideological flexibility were stunning. Deng's market Leninism appeared to contradict itself. Even after the crushing of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, foreign observers continued to anticipate that political liberalization would follow economic reform. Yet this did not happen, because unlike Western doctrine, in China, the government is not seen as a hindrance to economic prosperity, but a prerequisite to it. For Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, being part of the American security umbrella meant a social contract to enforce democratic reforms. In China, however, the preservation of the Communist Party demanded that market reforms be accompanied by political repression. Though unconventional, the success of this policy is hard to deny. Between 1978 and 2019, real GDP, measured according to current dollar value, grew from $150 billion to $14.3 trillion. That's mind-boggling growth. China's ascension to the World Trade Organization in 2001 reinforced its leading role in the global trading ecosystem. Being the world's factory meant that it was only a matter of time until China dominated international trade. While in 2001, around 2/3 of the world's nations traded more with Washington than with Beijing, by 2018, these numbers had reversed. Today, China is not only the world's factory, but also the world's leading trading partner. Exports as a means of economic growth have brought the country to this point, but to grow further still, China needs to foster its domestic markets. For the Beijing leadership, a mature and developed economy is the next objective. The Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative, and attempts to build a Chinese Silicon Valley all serve to that point. Though these programs may seem too small, too little to transform China from within, the modernization programs of the 1970s show that sometimes reform can be as dynamic as revolution. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you enjoy our work, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching and Sahol.